Millionaire pretended to be a beggar to test his family. When he reveals the truth, everyone is speechless. Carlos Montero, a name synonymous with success and opulence, stood on the balcony of his sprawling mansion in Rio de Janeiro. From there, he could see the glittering city skyline, a view that had once filled him with pride. Tonight, however, it brought no comfort. He swirled the brandy in his hand, the amber liquid catching the light of the chandeliers behind him. In the silence of his luxurious solitude, an unsettling question haunted him. What if I lost everything? Would they still love me? His wife Helena was inside, entertaining her friends in the lavish dining room. Their laughter echoed through the hallways, a sharp contrast to the turmoil in his mind. Their two children, Mariana and Lucas, had been texting their friends all evening, barely acknowledging his presence. Carlos sighed. He had spent decades building his empire, ensuring that his family lived a life of privilege. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were more in love with his wealth than with him. That evening, he sat at his desk, surrounded by trophies of his achievements, awards, framed photos with politicians, and the first contract that had catapulted his business to fame. None of it mattered. A plan began to form in his mind, a bold and unconventional way to test the bonds of his family. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Carlos, what a surprise, came the cheerful voice of Gabriel, a talented makeup artist who had worked for him during corporate events. Gabriel, I need your help. Something unconventional, Carlos began, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to propose. The following week, Gabriel arrived at the mansion, a suitcase full of makeup, prosthetics, and clothing that smelled of decay. For hours, Carlos sat in silence as Gabriel transformed him. Layers of grime and wrinkles were painted onto his face, a scraggly beard glued to his chin. Gabriel handed him tattered clothes that hung loosely on his frame. When Carlos looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. You're ready, Gabriel said, stepping back. But are you sure about this? Living on the streets isn't just a costume. It's a different world. I'm sure, Carlos replied, his voice firm. I need to know the truth. Before stepping out, Carlos left precise instructions with his lawyer, Marcelo. Keep all my businesses running as usual. Tell Helena I'm on a retreat, somewhere remote. No one is to know where I am or what I'm doing. Not even my family. Marcelo hesitated but ultimately nodded. Carlos Montero was not a man to argue with. As night fell, Carlos, now Joao, walked through the gates of his mansion. The doorman didn't recognize him. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of anonymity. He wandered into the heart of Rio, where the city's vibrancy gave way to shadows and despair. The bustling nightlife of Copacabana turned into dimly lit alleys, lined with cardboard beds and broken spirits. Carlos's heart pounded as he approached a group of homeless men, sitting around a makeshift fire. They eyed him warily, but offered him a spot near the flames. For the first time in his life, Carlos Montero was just another face in the crowd, a man with no name and no past. The first night was cold and unforgiving. Carlos shivered on a piece of damp cardboard, listening to the distant hum of cars and the occasional cry in the night. He thought of his wife's laughter and his children's carefree lives, wondering if they missed him yet. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Carlos vowed to see this journey through. He wasn't just testing his family, he was testing himself. For the first time, he would walk among the invisible people of the city he had always ruled from above. Little did he know, this experiment would uncover truths far beyond what he was prepared to face. The first morning on the streets brought a harsh dose of reality for Carlos Montero, or rather, Joao, the name he had chosen for his disguise. The city's warmth, so comforting when viewed from the safety of his mansion, was stifling and oppressive now. His tattered clothes clung to his skin, damp with sweat and dirt from his restless night. The world around him moved briskly, indifferent to his existence. Carlos walked to a nearby fountain in the square, where a few others were washing their faces or filling bottles. He caught his reflection in the murky water and marveled at the artistry of Gabriel's transformation. His once flawless skin was weathered and lined, his neatly combed hair now wild and speckled with gray. The scruffy beard and sunken eyes completed the image of a man who had lived a hard life. Even his gait had changed. He moved with the hunched shuffle of someone weighed down by time and suffering. The day stretched out ahead of him, empty and unfamiliar. Without a plan, Carlos wandered through Rio, observing the city from this new perspective. He passed luxurious cafes where he had once entertained business associates, their outdoor tables now a barrier between him and the life he used to lead. People avoided his gaze as if poverty were contagious. He noticed for the first time how many others like him, homeless and invisible, were scattered across the city. Hunger gnawed at him by mid-morning. Carlos searched through trash bins, an act that made his stomach churn with shame, even though he reminded himself this was temporary. To his dismay, most bins were already picked clean. He watched as other homeless individuals moved with practiced efficiency, knowing exactly where to go and what to look for. Carlos realized he was utterly unprepared for this life. By noon, desperation drove him to a street vendor selling pastels and fresh juices. The smell of fried dough and sweet fruit made his mouth water. Gathering his courage, Carlos approached the vendor. "Excuse me, sir. Could I have just one pastel? I don't have money, but I'm very hungry," he said, his voice cracking. The vendor barely glanced at him before shaking his head. "No handouts, meu amigo. Move along." Carlos's stomach tightened, not just from hunger but from humiliation. As he walked away, he heard the vendor muttering, "Another bum looking for a free meal." For the first time in decades, Carlos Montero was denied something he wanted. The sting of rejection was sharp, but it fueled his resolve. He decided to explore another area of the city, where fewer people might recognize him. João had to survive, even if it meant swallowing his pride. In a quieter neighborhood, Carlos sat on a bench watching the world go by. A street musician strummed a guitar nearby, his melancholic tune resonating with the hollow ache in Carlos's chest. For a moment, Carlos closed his eyes and let the music transport him, until the musician approached, hat in hand. "Any spare change, senor?" Carlos shook his head. "I wish I had something to give." The musician tilted his head, studying Carlos. "Rough day." Carlos almost laughed at the understatement. "Something like that." The musician sat beside him. "Name's Diego. You new to the streets?" Carlos hesitated but nodded. "Yes, I'm João." Diego's smile was knowing. "First few days are the hardest. You'll get used to it." They talked for a while, Diego sharing tips on where to find food and safe places to sleep. Carlos listened intently, grateful for the kindness of a stranger. When Diego finally left to play at another corner, Carlos felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't completely alone. That evening, Carlos made his way to one of the shelters Diego had mentioned. The line outside was long, filled with men, women, and even children. The sight of young faces broke his heart. As he waited, Carlos overheard fragments of conversations, stories of lost jobs, broken families, and illnesses that had drained savings accounts. These were people who had fallen through society's cracks, much like João himself. At least for now. When Carlos finally entered the shelter, he was given a thin mattress on the floor of a crowded room. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp clothing. As he lay down, he thought of his king-sized bed at home, with its silk sheets and endless pillows. His children probably slept peacefully in their rooms, unaware of his absence. The thought of his family sent a pang of longing through him. Did Helena miss him? Had Mariana or Lucas even noticed he was gone? Or were they too wrapped up in their comfortable lives to care? Carlos didn't want to admit it, but he feared the answers. That night, surrounded by strangers, Carlos made a promise to himself. He would endure the hardships of this new life, no matter how difficult. He needed to know the truth about his family, about the people he had surrounded himself with. And maybe, just maybe, he would learn something about himself along the way. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, Carlos felt both fear and determination. This journey was far from over, and the real challenges had yet to begin. From his vantage point in the park, Carlos Montero, disguised as João, watched the Montero family mansion through binoculars. It had been 3 days since his mysterious disappearance. He wondered how his wife, Helena, and his children, Mariana and Lucas, were coping with the sudden void he'd left behind. When Carlos first slipped away, Marcelo, his trusted lawyer, had delivered the carefully planned message to his family. Carlos had left for an unexpected retreat to focus on personal growth. The vagueness was deliberate. He wanted to see if worry or desperation would compel them to search for him. But the scene before him revealed no signs of turmoil. Helena, wearing an elegant sundress, emerged onto the veranda, her phone pressed to her ear. Carlos's heart fluttered with a pang of anticipation, hoping she was calling someone to search for him. Instead, her laughter rang out, light and untroubled. "Of course, darling. Lunch at the club tomorrow sounds divine," she said, sipping from a crystal glass. She paced the veranda, her movements graceful and relaxed, showing no outward signs of distress. Carlos's chest tightened. He had expected confusion, maybe tears, but this casual display of normalcy was jarring. Had Helena grown so accustomed to his presence, and his money, that she barely noticed his absence? As the hours stretched on, Carlos observed the house carefully. Lucas drove into the driveway in his sleek sports car, music blaring. Mariana followed soon after, carrying shopping bags from high-end boutiques. They exchanged a few words before retreating to their respective rooms. No frantic conversations. No signs of worry. The household seemed eerily calm. Carlos clenched his fists. Were they truly this indifferent to his disappearance? He reminded himself that 3 days wasn't long enough to judge their feelings, but the gnawing sense of betrayal lingered. The next morning, Carlos decided to venture closer. He changed his tattered shirt and rubbed extra dirt on his face to deepen the illusion. If his family could not recognize his voice, perhaps they would notice his eyes. The one feature Gabriel had struggled to disguise. He approached cautiously, positioning himself on the sidewalk outside the mansion's front gates. Helena stepped out of the house, dressed impeccably in a designer outfit, her perfume wafting through the air. Carlos's heart pounded as he stepped forward, raising a hand in a gesture of plea. "Señora," he called, his voice hoarse and pleading, "could you spare some food? I'm hungry." Helena froze, her eyes scanning him with thinly veiled disgust. "Get away from my property," she snapped, waving toward the security guard stationed near the gates. "Please," Carlos continued, his voice trembling. "Just a little bread." "Enough," she hissed, cutting him off. "I don't have time for this. Go beg somewhere else." Her words cut deeper than Carlos had anticipated. He stood frozen, his heart hammering as the security guard approached. For a fleeting moment, he considered breaking character, revealing his identity. But he stopped himself. He needed to see this through. Helena turned her back to him, the sound of her heels clicking as she strode to her waiting car. As the vehicle pulled away, Carlos caught a glimpse of her expression, cold, indifferent, and utterly detached. Shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak, Carlos slumped against the wall near the gate. This was the woman he had loved, trusted, and built his life with. How could she so easily dismiss another human being, even if she didn't know it was him? As dusk fell, Carlos turned his focus to his children. He followed Mariana to a trendy cafe, where she met friends for coffee. He waited until she was alone, then approached her at the table. "Señorita, forgive me," he began, his voice low. "I'm starving. Could you?" Mariana barely glanced up from her phone. With an exasperated sigh, she rummaged through her purse and tossed a few coins onto the table. "Here," she said, already typing again. Just go." Carlos stared at the coins, a hollow ache in his chest. "Thank you, miss," he murmured. He turned to leave, but couldn't resist glancing back. Mariana was taking a selfie, captioning it with asterisk, "Doing my part to help the less fortunate. #blessed, #giving back." Asterisk. That night, Carlos watched from the shadows as Lucas emerged from a high-end gym, his expensive duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The opportunity came as Lucas waited for a valet to bring his car. "Excuse me, sir," Carlos said, approaching cautiously. "Could you spare some change?" Lucas didn't even break stride. "Not today," he said curtly, brushing past Carlos as if he were invisible. When his luxury car pulled up, he got in without a backward glance, driving off into the night. Carlos stood there stunned as the sound of the engine faded. He had tried so hard to instill compassion and humility in his children. Where had he gone wrong? The disappointment weighed heavily on him as he trudged back to the shelter for another sleepless night. From his family's initial reactions, Carlos was beginning to see what he had feared the most. Their love and concern might have been tied more to his wealth than to him as a person. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He needed to dig deeper, to push harder, before making any decisions about the future. Tomorrow he decided he would try again. Carlos awoke in the corner of the shelter to the faint hum of voices and the harsh light of dawn streaming through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. He hadn't slept much, the weight of his family's apathy gnawing at him. Helena's cold dismissal, Mariana's performative generosity, and Lucas's indifference replayed in his mind like a haunting melody. Today, he resolved to confront Helena directly, not as her husband, but as the man she had turned away without a second thought. Perhaps face to face, with words rather than silent observation, he could glean something deeper about the woman he once believed he knew. By midday, he found himself on Rua das Palmeiras, one of the city's most exclusive streets, where Helena was having lunch with her closest friends at a renowned restaurant. The building exuded wealth, with polished glass walls, and a valet service managing a stream of luxury cars. Carlos lingered across the street, his heart pounding as he prepared for the confrontation. She emerged just as he expected, elegantly dressed, her hair perfectly styled, a designer handbag slung over her shoulder. She walked confidently, surrounded by her circle of friends. They paused outside the restaurant, exchanging air kisses and laughter. Carlos took a deep breath and stepped forward, crossing the street toward her. The sharp smell of exhaust and the blaring of a distant car horn barely registered as he approached. His voice, deliberately cracked and raspy, reached her ears just as she was about to enter her car. "Señora, please," he began, keeping his tone pleading but steady. "A little kindness. Just enough for a meal." Helena froze. Her smile faltered as her friends shifted awkwardly, one of them murmuring, "These people are everywhere these days." Carlos could see her eyes harden as she turned to face him. "I told you to stay away," she snapped, the faintest hint of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Security," she barked, signaling to the restaurant staff. "Helena," Carlos said softly, just loud enough for her to hear. The sound of her name stopped her mid-stride. She squinted at him, her eyes narrowing as if trying to place his face. For a fleeting moment, Carlos thought she might recognize him. Instead, her expression turned to one of disdain. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, her voice sharp and defensive. Carlos hesitated, then said, "It doesn't matter who I am. Please, I just need help. Just a moment of your time." Helena took a step back, wrinkling her nose. "I don't have time for this nonsense. Do you think I'm some charity worker? Go find someone else to bother." Her words struck like a whip, the finality in her tone leaving no room for appeal. Carlos's shoulders slumped as she turned to her friends, muttering something about the state of the city, before stepping into her car and driving away. Carlos stood there, rooted to the spot, as the humiliation washed over him. The restaurant staff hovered nearby, watching warily to ensure he didn't disturb other patrons. He felt the heat of their judgmental stares, the weight of their unspoken words. "What is someone like you doing here?" As he walked away, his legs heavy with defeat, he reflected on the encounter. Helena hadn't recognized him. Not his voice, not his eyes, not the faint familiarity that should have transcended his disguise. She had looked at him as if he were a nuisance, an obstacle to her carefully curated life. He found a bench in a nearby park and sank into it, his head in his hands. The world bustled around him, people walking briskly, oblivious to the man who had once commanded power and respect, now reduced to a shadow of himself. He thought of the early days of his marriage to Helena, the shared dreams, the quiet evenings, and the promises they'd made to each other. Had all of that been an illusion? As the day turned to evening, Carlos resolved not to let this setback deter him. If Helena's heart had grown cold, it was only part of the puzzle he was trying to solve. His children still remained, and he had not yet given them enough reason to show their true colors. One by one, he would test them all. And if, in the end, they failed to meet his expectations, Carlos knew he would need to make decisions that would change all their lives forever. Carlos Montero, now fully inhabiting the identity of João, spent the next morning wandering the streets of Rio de Janeiro, rehearsing the words he would use to approach his children. After the unsettling encounter with Helena, his hope for his family's empathy was wearing thin. He knew Mariana and Lucas were not like their mother in many ways, but their privileged lives had insulated them from the struggles of ordinary people. If there was compassion left in their hearts, Carlos was determined to find it. He started with Mariana, his eldest. Through discreet observation, he learned she had a regular routine of visiting a trendy gym, followed by her favorite cafe in Ipanema. That afternoon, he waited outside the cafe, his nerves on edge as patrons came and went. When she finally arrived, she looked every bit the affluent socialite. Athleisure outfit, expensive handbag, and oversized sunglasses perched on her flawless face. Carlos approached carefully as she sat at a table by the window, scrolling on her phone. He adopted the posture and tone of a man beaten down by life, a persona that was becoming disturbingly easy to embody. "Señorita," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Forgive me for disturbing you, but I haven't eaten today. Could you spare something small to help me?" Mariana looked up startled. For a brief second their eyes met. Carlos's heart raced, wondering if she would see through the disguise. But her gaze shifted quickly, her expression hardening with discomfort. She sighed, opening her purse with a dramatic flourish. From its depths, she produced a handful of coins, which she placed on the edge of the table without a word. "Here," she said flatly, her tone implying she was doing him a favor simply by acknowledging him. "Thank you," Carlos murmured, taking the coins with trembling fingers. He turned to leave, but couldn't resist glancing back. Mariana had already returned to her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Moments later, a notification pinged, and he saw her posing for a selfie. The caption flashed briefly. Asterisk, doing my part to help the needy. Hashtag grateful, hashtag blessed. Asterisk. Carlos clenched his jaw, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He had hoped for warmth, a genuine connection, but her actions felt performative, empty. He left the cafe, the coins jangling in his pocket like a cruel reminder of her shallow generosity. Later that evening, Carlos set his sights on Lucas. His son was harder to track down, often changing plans and frequenting new spots with his friends. Carlos finally found him outside an exclusive nightclub, where he had parked his luxury sports car. Dressed in a tailored blazer and designer shoes, Lucas was laughing with his friends as they prepared to head inside. Carlos waited for the right moment, approaching as Lucas paused to speak with the valet. "Excuse me, sir," Carlos began, keeping his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I'm in a tough spot and could use some help. Just a little money for food or—" Lucas cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Not now, man," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "I don't carry cash." Carlos pressed on, hoping to evoke even a sliver of compassion. "I understand, but anything helps. I wouldn't ask if—" "Look, I said no," Lucas snapped, his voice rising. He shot Carlos a glare before turning to the valet. "Can you believe these people? Always looking for handouts." The valet didn't respond, handing Lucas the keys to his car instead. With a loud rev of the engine, Lucas sped off into the night, leaving Carlos standing in the exhaust fumes, his shoulders sagging under the weight of disappointment. Carlos returned to the shelter that night, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The image of Lucas driving away, and Mariana's shallow selfie, replayed in his head. How had his children, the ones he had nurtured and provided for, become so disconnected from the values he thought he had instilled in them? Memories of their childhood surfaced unbidden. Mariana baking cookies with him in the kitchen, Lucas showing off a drawing he'd made for Father's Day. They had been kind, loving children once, when had wealth and privilege hardened their hearts. As he lay on the thin mattress, the dull ache of the day's rejection mingling with the distant hum of city noise, Carlos resolved to go deeper. There had to be a reason for their behavior, an underlying cause he hadn't yet uncovered. Perhaps the fault lay with him, too consumed by his work to notice the cracks forming in their characters. He wouldn't give up. Not yet. Tomorrow, he would take a different approach, something to draw out the essence of who they truly were beneath the layers of wealth and status. But for now, he closed his eyes, letting the sorrow and fatigue wash over him. The last thought in his mind, a question he dreaded to answer. What if this is who they've become? The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the city of Rio de Janeiro in soft shades of orange and pink. Carlos, or João as the world now knew him, trudged through the narrow streets of a modest neighborhood. His body ached from days of walking, his spirits worn thin by the rejection and indifference he had encountered from those he once considered his world. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, and the coins Mariana had tossed him barely covered a stale sandwich and a bottle of water. He stopped outside a small corner bakery, staring at the warm glow of its interior and the freshly baked loaves displayed in the window. The smell of bread and pastries wafted through the air, making his stomach rumble. A line of people stretched from the counter to the door, chatting and laughing as they waited their turn. Carlos stood there for a moment, hesitant before turning away. He had no more coins to spend, and the humiliation of begging yet again was too much to bear. He shuffled down the road, his head bowed, when a voice called out behind him, "Señor João, wait!" Carlos turned to see an elderly woman hobbling toward him, her silver hair tied in a loose bun, and a knitted shawl draped over her frail shoulders. It was Dona Zelia, an old neighbor he barely remembered from years ago, when he had first bought the Montero mansion. She had always been quiet and unassuming, someone he'd exchanged pleasantries with in passing, but never truly noticed. "Good evening, Señora," Carlos said, his voice weak. He hoped she wouldn't recognize him through his disguise. "You look like you've seen better days," she said, her warm brown eyes scanning his face. "Are you hungry?" Carlos hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Pride still clung stubbornly to him even now, but his empty stomach spoke louder. "Yes," he admitted softly. "I haven't had a meal since this morning." Dona Zelia clucked her tongue and motioned for him to follow. Come, I'll make you something." She led him to a small, humble house tucked at the end of the street. The yard was overgrown, and the paint on the walls had long since faded, but it exuded a quiet warmth. Inside, the space was modest but tidy, filled with the smell of lavender and the soft ticking of an old clock. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of children and grandchildren, their smiling faces a testament to the love that filled this home. "Sit," she said, pointing to a worn but sturdy chair by the kitchen table. She busied herself at the stove, humming a tune as she worked. Before long, she placed a steaming plate of rice, beans, and fried eggs in front of him. "Eat, my boy," she urged. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." Carlos stared at the food, his throat tightening with gratitude. "Thank you, Señora," he whispered before digging in. Each bite was a balm to his weary soul, the simple meal tasting better than any gourmet dish he had ever eaten. As he ate, Zelia sat across from him, knitting a scarf with nimble fingers. "So, João," she began, "what's your story? You don't look like the others who wander these streets." Carlos froze for a moment. He had spent days perfecting his disguise, but his old neighbor's intuition was sharper than he had anticipated. "It's a long story," he said evasively, taking another bite to buy himself time. "Let's just say life hasn't been kind lately." Zelia nodded, her gaze softening. "Life rarely is, but it's in the hardest moments that we find out who we truly are." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He realized how little he had known about this woman, this neighbor who had lived mere blocks from his mansion. While he had been consumed by the trappings of wealth, she had quietly embodied the values he had once held dear. "Why are you helping me?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop it. Zelia paused her knitting, looking at him thoughtfully. "Because someone helped me once," she said simply. "When my husband passed, I had nothing. No money, no family close by. A kind stranger saw my need and gave me a chance to get back on my feet. It's a debt I've been repaying ever since." Carlos swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. Here was a woman with so little, yet she gave so freely. Her gesture was a stark contrast to the behavior of his wife and children, who had everything but offered nothing. After dinner, Zelia insisted he stay the night. "It's too dangerous out there after dark," she said firmly, guiding him to a small couch in the corner of her living room. She handed him a knitted blanket and patted his shoulder gently. "Rest now, João. Tomorrow is a new day." As Carlos lay there, the warmth of the blanket and the kindness of her gesture wrapping around him, he felt a glimmer of hope rekindle within him. Perhaps not all was lost. Amid the disappointment and heartache, there were still people like Zelia, proof that compassion and generosity could thrive, even in the harshest of circumstances. For the first time in days, Carlos slept soundly, and when he awoke, he was more determined than ever to see his journey through to the end, no matter what truths it uncovered. The morning air was crisp as Carlos Montero, still in his guise as João, made his way to a nondescript cafe tucked in the quieter streets of Rio de Janeiro. He had arranged a secret meeting with his lawyer Marcelo to check on the state of his businesses and ensure that his month-long absence hadn't stirred suspicions. Though his heart still ached from his family's indifference, the unexpected kindness of Dona Zelia had reignited his resolve. Marcelo was already waiting when Carlos entered the cafe. The lawyer sat at a corner table, his tailored suit and polished demeanor standing out in the modest surroundings. He tapped his fingers anxiously on the table, glancing around the room. When Carlos approached, Marcelo's eyes widened briefly in shock before settling into a wary recognition. "Carlos," he whispered, his voice low. "Is that really you?" "Yes, it's me," Carlos said, sitting down quickly and pulling his hood lower over his face. "Do I look the part?" Marcelo nodded, his brow furrowed. "You look convincing. But this plan of yours is madness. Do you know what kind of risks you're taking?" Carlos leaned forward, his voice firm. "This isn't about risks, Marcelo. It's about the truth. Now tell me, how are things? Has anyone started asking questions?" Marcelo sighed, pulling a folder from his briefcase and sliding it across the table. "The businesses are fine. Everything is running smoothly, just as you instructed. Helena has told everyone you're at a retreat. But," he hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with his pen. "But what?" Carlos pressed, his voice tightening. "She's been trying to access your accounts," Marcelo admitted. "She's spoken to several brokers about liquidating assets. High-value ones, properties, shares, even your art collection." Carlos felt his chest tighten. "Without my authorization?" Marcelo shook his head. "She doesn't have the power to finalize anything. Your legal instructions are airtight." "But Carlos, it's clear she's planning something. If I hadn't stepped in with vague excuses about delays, she might have pushed harder." Carlos sat back, his thoughts racing. Helena's actions confirmed his deepest fears. Was her concern for his disappearance genuine, or was she simply waiting to benefit from his absence? Her detachment during his initial observations had stung, but this blatant move for his wealth felt like a betrayal of an entirely different magnitude. "And what about my children?" Carlos asked, though he already knew the answer. Marcelo hesitated again, as if unsure how to soften the blow. "They're going about their lives as usual. Lucas has made a few extravagant purchases. A new car, some high-end gadgets. Mariana's been hosting gatherings at the mansion." He lowered his voice. "It's almost as if nothing's changed." The words hung heavy between them. Carlos clenched his fists under the table, a mixture of frustration and sadness bubbling to the surface. "They don't care," he muttered bitterly. "Not about me. Not about anything but themselves." Marcelo leaned forward, his tone more serious. "Carlos, are you sure about this? You could reveal yourself now, confront them, and take control of the situation. You don't have to keep putting yourself through this." Carlos shook his head, his expression resolute. "No, not yet. I need to see this through. If I confront them now, they'll make excuses, promise to change. But I won't know if it's genuine. I need to understand who they truly are. What they'll do when they think I'm not coming back." Marcelo sighed, slipping the folder back into his briefcase. "Then you'd better be prepared for what you find. Sometimes the truth isn't what we want it to be." Before leaving, Carlos gave Marcelo clear instructions to tighten his oversight on Helena's actions. "Delay everything," he said. "If she pushes harder, let me know immediately." Marcelo nodded but looked uneasy. "And you, Carlos? What will you do now?" Carlos stood, adjusting the hood over his head. "I'll keep observing, testing. I need to be sure." As Carlos stepped out of the cafe and into the bustling streets, his mind swirled with conflicting emotions. Marcelo's news had confirmed much of what he had already suspected. but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more painful. Helena's greed and his children's apathy were hard to reconcile with the memories of the family he had once cherished. But he also thought of Dona Zelia and the kindness she had shown him despite having so little herself. It was proof that not everyone was driven by selfishness and materialism. It reminded him of what he valued most, what he had tried to build for his family, but had somehow lost along the way. Walking aimlessly through the streets, Carlos made a silent vow. If his family's behavior didn't change, he would make drastic decisions, ones that would reshape not only their lives but his own. This was no longer just about their loyalty. It was about rediscovering his own purpose and deciding what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. He turned a corner and spotted a group of children playing soccer in the street, their laughter echoing through the air. For a moment he paused, watching them with a bittersweet smile. There was still innocence in the world, untainted by greed or ambition. Maybe he could find a way to preserve that for others, even if his family had lost it. As the sun began to set, Carlos walked back to the shelter, a renewed determination in his step. The end of his journey was drawing closer, but the most challenging days were still ahead. The Montero mansion was ablaze with light that evening, its grand chandeliers illuminating the opulence within. Helena, Mariana, and Lucas arrived separately, their confusion evident as they gathered in the lavish dining room. Each had received an ornate invitation to an exclusive dinner, signed by someone named João. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. "What is this nonsense?" Lucas muttered, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket. "Some charity stunt." Helena, dressed in a sleek black gown, narrowed her eyes as she inspected the card again. "I don't understand. João, do either of you know who this is?" Mariana shrugged, flipping her hair over one shoulder. "Maybe it's a new chef or something. Honestly, I don't see why we had to come. I had plans tonight." Helena's sharp gaze silenced her daughter's complaints. "Whoever this João is, he had the audacity to use my dining room for this event. We'll find out soon enough." As they settled into their seats, the tension was palpable. The table was set with the finest silverware, crystal glasses sparkling under the light. A strange air of expectancy filled the room. They glanced at one another, their unease growing with every passing moment. Finally, the doors to the dining room swung open. A figure stepped inside, clean-shaven, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. His hair was neatly combed, his posture commanding. For a brief moment, the three stared at him, confusion turning to shock as recognition dawned. "Carlos." Helena's voice wavered, her hands gripping the table. "Is that you, Dad?" Mariana whispered, her eyes wide. Lucas simply froze, his jaw tightening. Carlos Montero, the man they had thought was absent or unreachable, stood before them, his gaze steady and unyielding. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, and took his place at the head of the table. "Yes, it's me," he said finally, his voice calm but laced with an edge that sent a chill through the room. "Though, I suppose I've been someone else these past few weeks." Helena was the first to recover from her shock. "What is going on, Carlos? Where have you been? And why this charade?" Carlos held up a hand, silencing her. "I've been João," he said simply, "living on the streets, begging for food, watching each of you from a distance." A heavy silence fell over the room. Mariana and Lucas exchanged uneasy glances, while Helena's expression darkened. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "You've been spying on us? Pretending to be a homeless man? For what? Some cruel game?" "It's not a game, Helena," Carlos replied sharply, his tone cutting through her indignation. "It's a test. A test to see what kind of people you are when the world isn't watching. When there's no wealth or status tying us together." The color drained from Mariana's face. "Dad, you're being dramatic. We didn't even know where you were. How could we have?" "Stop," Carlos interrupted, his gaze locking onto hers. "I approached you, Mariana, as João. I asked for help, and you threw coins at me like I was an inconvenience. Then you posted about it online, pretending you cared." Mariana's mouth opened, but no words came. She sank back in her chair, her cheeks flushed with shame. Carlos turned to Lucas. "And you, Lucas? You brushed me off like I was invisible. You couldn't even spare a second glance." Lucas bristled, his voice defensive. What was I supposed to do? I didn't know it was you. Carlos's voice rose, his frustration bubbling to the surface. It shouldn't have mattered who I was. A stranger in need is still a person worthy of dignity and compassion. But you, both of you, showed me exactly how little you value those ideals. Helena, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally spoke, her voice trembling. And what about me, Carlos? Are you going to lecture me too? Carlos's eyes softened, but only slightly. You didn't recognize me, Helena. You looked at me like I was beneath you. You had the power to help. But instead, you turned me away. I didn't know, Helena whispered, her voice breaking. How could I have known? That's the point, Carlos said, his voice heavy with disappointment. You shouldn't have to know someone's identity to treat them with kindness. The weight of his words hung over the table, suffocating in its intensity. No one dared speak. The family's carefully constructed facade of wealth and status lay in ruins, replaced by the stark truth of their actions. Carlos took a deep breath, his expression softening just enough to show a flicker of vulnerability. I didn't do this to punish you. I did it to understand, to see who you are beneath the privilege. And what I've learned, I can't ignore it. He stood, the authority in his posture unmistakable. Starting tomorrow, things will change. Part of my wealth will be donated to social projects, helping those who truly need it. The rest will be managed differently. No more reckless spending or indulgent luxuries. Helena shot to her feet, her voice sharp. Carlos, you can't. Yes, I can, he said firmly. And I will. His gaze swept over them one last time, his disappointment evident. This family has lost its way, but I'm determined to find my own. You can choose to reflect on what you've done, or you can continue as you are. Either way, I'm moving forward. Without another word, Carlos turned and walked out of the room, leaving his family in stunned silence. For the first time in their lives, Helena, Mariana, and Lucas were forced to confront the stark reality of their actions, and the man who was no longer willing to shield them from the consequences. The following morning, the Montero mansion was shrouded in an unnatural quiet. The usual hum of activity, the clatter of staff preparing breakfast, the buzz of phones, and the distant sound of Lucas's music, was replaced by an air of uncertainty. Helena sat at the head of the dining table, a steaming cup of coffee untouched in front of her. Her makeup, usually flawless, was hastily applied, and her normally composed demeanor seemed frayed at the edges. Mariana and Lucas sat nearby, both scrolling aimlessly through their phones, pretending not to notice their mother's anxious glances. They all knew why Carlos had called for a family meeting. When he finally entered the room, dressed sharply in a dark suit, the tension thickened. He carried a leather briefcase, which he placed deliberately on the table before taking a seat. His calm, measured movements contrasted starkly with the swirling emotions in the room. Good morning, Carlos began, his tone neutral but firm. He opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder filled with papers. I've spent the past month observing, reflecting, and preparing for this moment. Today, we address the consequences of what I've learned. Helena straightened, her composure returning as she met his gaze. Carlos, you've made your point. We understand, and we're willing to make changes. But this, she gestured toward the folder, it doesn't have to come to this. We can work through things together. Carlos's eyes softened momentarily, but his resolve remained intact. I wish I could believe that, Helena. But this isn't just about promises or intentions. It's about action. He slid a set of documents across the table to each of them. Effective immediately, I'm restructuring our financial situation. Mariana, Lucas, you'll receive modest monthly allowances. Enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. If you want more, you'll need to earn it. Lucas's face turned red, his fist tightening around the papers. You're kidding, right? What am I supposed to do with this? You can't expect me to live like some average person. Carlos met his outburst with a calm stare. That's exactly what I expect. It's time you learn the value of work and responsibility. Mariana, who had been silent, finally spoke up, her voice shaky. This isn't fair, Dad. You've always provided for us. We didn't ask for this life. No, Carlos replied, his tone sharp. But you've taken it for granted. And that ends now. He turned to Helena. who was gripping her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Helena, I've decided to dissolve our marriage." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Helena's breath hitched, and for a moment, she seemed frozen in disbelief. "You're divorcing me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Carlos nodded, his expression pained but resolute. "I can't continue in a relationship built on pretense. Your actions these past weeks, trying to sell my assets behind my back, treating people with such disregard. They've made it clear that we've grown too far apart." Helena's composure cracked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. "You can't just throw everything away. We've built a life together, a family. You can't give up on us like this." Carlos's voice softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "I'm not giving up, Helena. I'm choosing to start over, to find meaning in something real. You can do the same. Or not. That's up to you." He stood, closing the folder with a finality that echoed through the room. "I've also decided to donate a significant portion of my wealth to social projects, foundations that support the homeless, education initiatives, and community development programs. The details are already in motion." Mariana and Lucas gaped at him, their protests dying on their lips. Helena simply sat in stunned silence, her world crumbling around her. Carlos's gaze swept over them one last time, his expression unreadable. This family has the chance to rebuild itself, to rediscover what truly matters. But I won't force it. The choice is yours. With that, he picked up his briefcase and walked out, leaving them to grapple with the reality of their new lives. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. Carlos moved out of the mansion, taking up temporary residence in a modest apartment closer to the city center. He spent his days finalizing the launch of his new foundation, which he had decided to name the Zelia Initiative in honor of the elderly woman who had reignited his faith in humanity. Helena, meanwhile, retreated into herself, struggling to come to terms with the dissolution of her marriage. She stopped attending her usual social events, the weight of public scrutiny too much to bear. Mariana and Lucas, stripped of their endless luxuries, were forced to confront the realities of a life they had never known, a life where wealth wasn't guaranteed. At first, they resisted, clinging to their old habits and blaming their father for their predicament. But slowly, cracks began to appear in their facades. Mariana started volunteering at a local shelter, initially as a way to regain her father's favor, but eventually finding fulfillment in helping others. Lucas, after much prodding, took a part-time job at a gym, where he began to understand the satisfaction of earning his own way. Carlos watched these developments from afar, hopeful but cautious. He knew the road to transformation would be long and fraught with setbacks. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a sense that he was finally living a life aligned with his values. As he stood on the balcony of his new apartment, gazing out at the bustling city below, Carlos felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Months had passed since Carlos Montero shed his identity as Joao and revealed the truth to his family. The transformation he had hoped for was not instantaneous, but slow, subtle shifts had begun to take root. The Montero family was no longer defined by its wealth or status. Instead, it was being rebuilt on the foundation of hard-earned lessons and humility. Carlos stood in the spacious yet understated office of the Zelia Initiative, named after the woman who had shown him kindness when he had least expected it. The foundation's headquarters were bustling with activity, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal boardrooms he had once commanded. The sound of laughter and collaboration filled the air as staff members worked tirelessly on projects to uplift the city's underserved communities. On his desk lay a report detailing the initiative's progress. In the months since its launch, the foundation had opened 3 shelters, funded job training programs, and partnered with local schools to provide scholarships for underprivileged students. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding, a far cry from the detached corporate empire he had once led. As Carlos reviewed the numbers, his assistant knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Montero, Dona Zelia is here to see you." Carlos's face lit up. "Please send her in." The elderly woman entered, her warm smile as radiant as ever. "Look at you, all important now," she teased, settling into the chair across from him. Carlos chuckled. If I'm important, it's because of you, Dona Zelia. This wouldn't exist without your kindness. She waved a dismissive hand. Oh, nonsense. You had it in you all along. You just needed a reminder. They talked for a while, sharing updates and ideas for future projects. As they spoke, Carlos felt a deep sense of gratitude for this second chance. Not just to rebuild himself, but to create something meaningful for others. Meanwhile, Helena sat in her modest new home, flipping through a journal she had begun keeping after the family's upheaval. Writing had become her way of processing the shock of losing her marriage and the life she had built around wealth. At first, the entries had been filled with anger and bitterness, but over time, they evolved into reflections on her mistakes and aspirations for the future. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Mariana. Volunteering at the shelter today. Want to join? Helena stared at the screen, surprised. Her daughter had grown distant during the aftermath of Carlos's revelations, but recently, they had started to reconnect. With a small smile, Helena typed back, I'd love to. At a bustling local gym. Lucas wiped sweat from his brow after finishing a shift. He had taken a part-time job as a trainer, partly out of necessity, and partly to prove to himself that he could stand on his own. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him a sense of pride he hadn't felt before. As he left the gym, he glanced at the message his father had sent earlier that morning. Lunch this weekend? Would love to catch up. For the first time in months, Lucas didn't feel the sting of resentment. Instead, he found himself looking forward to seeing his father. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, the Montero family reunited for a simple lunch at a neighborhood cafe, far from the opulent restaurants they once frequented. Carlos arrived first, choosing a corner table where the noise of the city hummed softly in the background. One by one, his family trickled in. Helena, looking more at ease than he had seen her in years. Mariana, carrying a box of leftover food she planned to bring to the shelter. And Lucas, whose handshake felt firmer, more confident. As they sat together, the conversation was cautious at first, but it quickly warmed into laughter and shared stories. There was a different energy between them now, not one born of obligation or appearances, but of genuine effort to reconnect. Toward the end of the meal, Carlos leaned back in his chair, observing his family with a quiet smile. They were not perfect, nor would they ever be, but they were trying, and that was enough. Helena broke the silence, looking at Carlos with an expression of gratitude. Thank you, she said softly, for forcing us to see what we couldn't before. Carlos nodded, his voice steady. It's not about looking back. It's about what we do from here. As the months turned into years, the Monteros continued to grow, not just individually, but as a family. Mariana pursued a career in social work, inspired by her time volunteering. Lucas eventually started his own fitness studio, creating an inclusive space that offered free classes for low-income clients. Helena became an advocate for women's shelters, using her social connections to raise funds and awareness. And Carlos, he found peace in his work with the Zelia Initiative, knowing that his wealth and influence were finally being used to make a tangible difference. Though he no longer lived in the grand mansion or wore the title of CEO, he felt richer than ever. One evening, as he walked through the city, Carlos passed a group of children playing soccer in a narrow alley. Their laughter echoed through the air, a reminder of the simple joys he had rediscovered. He paused, watching them for a moment before one of the boys called out, "Want to join us, senor?" Carlos smiled, rolling up his sleeves. Why not? As he joined their game, kicking the ball with a lightness in his step, Carlos realized he had found something far more valuable than all the wealth in the world: purpose, connection, and a life truly worth living.